All right, if you'll open your Korans. No, I'm just kidding. Matthew chapter 13 is where we're going to be tonight. And I want to get extra credit. I think I ought to get extra credit because this is the third time that I've preached since the School of Ministry started in the main service. So I hope I can get some extra credit and actually be able to pass this term. Fantastic. Matthew chapter 13. I also want to say, I am really upset with myself because this sermon will have to do with responding to preaching and responding to the church service. I did not turn my microphone on yet, my bad. Is responding to the church service, and I didn't read it at all before I prepared this sermon, and I should have, because it was the sermon is exactly about what that Baptist Time says it's about, and I completely missed out on it. I do look forward to reading it later. I do have it on my desk waiting for me, but man, I'm pretty bummed that I missed out on it before I prepared the sermon. But we're going to be in Matthew 13. And as usual, we'll read it and then we'll pray and then we'll get into it. But we're going to start after the parable of the sower. So this chapter mostly has to do with the parable of the sower, which we'll talk about briefly, and you should be mostly familiar with, but we'll describe it here in a little bit. But we're going to look at the disciples and Jesus' conversation between the two passages talking about the parable of the sower. So that starts in verse 10. And the disciples are confused, as they tend to be. And we have what follows is Jesus explaining his mindset on why he tells parables. So, chapter 13, verse 10, we'll read our passage. Verse 10. And the disciples came and said unto him, Why speakest thou unto them in parables? He answered and said unto them, Because it is given unto you to know the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven, but to them it is not given. For whosoever hath, to him shall be given, and he shall have more abundance. But whosoever hath not, from him shall be taken away, even that he hath. Therefore speak I to them in parables, because they seeing see not, and hearing they hear not, neither do they understand. And in them is fulfilled the prophecy of Isaiah, which saith, By hearing ye shall hear, and shall not understand. And seeing ye shall see, and shall not perceive. For this people's heart is waxed gross, and their ears are dull of hearing, and their eyes they have closed, lest at any time they should see with their eyes, and hear with their hearts, and should understand with their heart, and should be converted, and I should heal them. But blessed are your eyes, for they see, and your ears, for they hear. For verily I say unto you, that many prophets and righteous men have desired to see those things which ye see, and have not seen them, and to hear those things which ye hear, and have not heard them. So please pray with me real quick, and then we'll get into the preaching. Dear Heavenly Father, I thank you for this passage, and I thank you for another opportunity we have as a church to be able to open up your word, to hear the word preached and to have it confront us where we live. And I pray that we would take this time seriously, that we would tune in, we would listen to what you have for us out of your word, and that we would all examine ourselves to how it might apply to us. I pray that you'd be with me as I speak. Give me liberty, give me the grace that I need in order to preach the sermon effectively. I pray that you'd be with me and be with the people that are listening, and let this sermon bring glory to you. In Jesus' name, amen. After winter and at the beginning of spring, unto now, I went through a kick where I was really worried about my lawn. I'd never thought about my lawn before, but for some reason, I don't know if I saw somebody else's lawn that I thought looked nice, or I saw a random YouTube video, but suddenly this is what I was decided I was going to focus on with my springtime. I watched all the YouTube videos I could find. I bought all the tools and the supplies that I needed, took a lot of trips to Jerry's, found Jarrett a lot at Jerry's to ask him what I needed. I even bought lawn feed. I didn't know lawn feed was a thing before I started this. And I spent hours weeding the front lawn, trying to get all the weeds out and trying to in order to put new grass seed down to make my lawn look better. And then after I got all the weeds out, it was time to lay the grass seed. And the seed didn't grow. And I was confused because I thought I did everything right, and the seed wasn't growing. And the seed that did grow, it would soon die after it sprouted up. And I was confused because I thought I did everything right. I even tilled the ground. Why wasn't this seed growing? Well, I wasn't tilling the seed into the dirt, and I didn't realize that that's something I had to do. I was tilling the dirt, and then I was laying the seed on top of the dirt and calling that good. But apparently, as I would find out, you're supposed to till the seed into the dirt and mix it together. Those of you who are lawn experts, you're like, oh, well, duh, why didn't you do that the first time? And like, I was a noob. I didn't know anything about this, and now I do. And then when I go at it again next spring, I'll know what to do. But this time I had no idea. And so now you can see the spots where were my first attempts, and you can elsewhere see the spots that were my second and third attempts, and they look far better. And overall, my lawn looks way better than it did before. But you can see my first attempts and my later attempts because I didn't know how to lay seed properly. I didn't know how to prepare the ground and to make it ready for the seed. Now, of course, summer's taken its course, so most of the grass is dead, and all my work seems for naught, but at least there's no weeds. But you can see where I prepared the ground for the seed and where I didn't. You can see the difference. My point is this. Obviously, there was no problem with the grass seed. It was the same seed that I used. There was no problem with the grass seed. The problem was with the soil underneath it. I didn't prepare the soil well enough to be ready for the seed. It wasn't prepared for grass seed, so it didn't grow grass seed into grass. It just was grass seed until it died. Why did my grass seed not turn into grass? Because the soil wasn't prepared. My second question for tonight is, why does preaching not move me anymore, if that's a question you've had before? Why does the preaching not affect me like it used to? You know, you might say, when I got saved, everything was so exciting. But now it seems like the preaching has changed or something, because I just don't find it as exciting or as moving anymore. There's something different. Sure, I love going to church. I love the fellowship. I love the community. I love the singing. I love cookie time after Sunday morning service. But you know, I just don't get anything out of the preaching like I used to. Did the preaching change? Jesus said in this passage, he begins this chapter with, "Behold, a sower went forth to sow." And you can imagine maybe as he's there near the Sea of Galilee, and he has this crowd of people around him, that he gestures to the side, and perhaps there's a farmer actively in the process of growing his crops, and he has a bag, a satchel on him, and he's throwing his grass seed out, and indiscriminately he throws it wherever it might land, and Jesus talks about some of the soil it might land on. He talks about how the seed fell on the wayside, or the thorns, or the stony ground, and all of that seed, it wasn't grass seed probably, but all that seed that he threw died. But other seed fell on good ground, and it flourished. And then he closes this parable with this strange phrase: "He who hath ears to hear, let him hear," in verse 9. He who hath ears to hear, let him hear. What makes the difference between the dead seed and the seed that flourishes? And why do some people evidently not have ears to hear? What causes a man have ears but not being able to hear? And that's the question that Jesus answers in our passage that we're looking at. So the disciples, in verse 10, were confused as to why Jesus felt it necessary all the time to preach in parables, because it confused them. Now, the disciples, as a general rule, didn't really need an excuse to be confused. They tended to be confused most times, most places you open up in the Gospels. That's just how they were. They were disciples, and they got confused. But this time, the parables is what's confusing them. And they say, "Jesus, why can't you just explain it plainly? Why are you always preaching in parables?" Like I said, they didn't need an excuse to be confused, but Jesus did often preach in parables. Okay, what's a parable? Well, a parable, simply put, is a story. And Jesus he absolutely loved to preach through stories. He did it all the time. I don't know if this is true, what I'm about to say, but I think about the scripture as a whole, I think most of the time that he preached, it was through parables, or a parable was involved in some way. He loved preaching through parables, because he loved stories. After all, he wrote the Bible, and the Bible, for the most part, is a bunch of stories that God decided to give to us. Jesus loved stories. Parables are basically the same thing as a sermon illustration, except the whole sermon is an illustration. And some of you are like, that sounds awesome. To me, that sounds awful to prepare for. But for Jesus, that's how he loved to preach. He loved to preach an illustration. His entire sermon would be an illustration. And so the disciples ask, why are you always preaching through parables instead of saying what you mean plainly? And Jesus answers in a strange way in verse 11. He answered and said unto them, because it is given unto you to know the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven, but to them it is not given. Jesus almost seems to say that he is purposefully concealing the truth from the multitudes. That's what it sounds like when you read it at first glance. Now, a couple clarifying truths that'll help this make a little bit more sense. First of all, Jesus' heart was for everyone to be saved. Everyone in the crowd, he wanted all of them to be saved. He was also trying to teach the disciples as much as possible, as efficiently as possible. That's his second goal while he was on the earth, was to teach the disciples so that when he left, they would be ready. And his third goal was not to die too soon. He didn't want to die yet. His goal was the cross, but if he would have come down and started preaching to everybody that he was God and that Judaism needed to be overthrown because Christianity is here, he would not have had a 3-year ministry. He probably wouldn't have made it 3 months. So he has those 3 goals. And so he purposefully would not let all the truth out so as not to upset his plan. His plan was to teach the disciples more so that they could go out and teach everyone else, and he didn't want to die too soon. That was Jesus' plan. So he would preach through parables. Jesus reveals some to the crowds through the parables, and then he reveals more to his disciples in private conversations later. That was what he tended to do. That's what he does in this chapter. He reveals truth in a way, and he reveals truth in a way where those who wanted to learn more would be given enough to chew on, and they would have questions to ask. And then Jesus was quite ready to answer those questions. The parables, Jesus' public sermons were like appetizers to whet their appetite so that they would want to come back for more. That was Jesus' point, and that's how he preached to the crowds. It's like when you go at Costco and you have the samples that are at the end of the aisle. I assume it's like that at Costco too. I only know of Sam's Club. But are there samples at Costco? Is that a thing? Okay, right. So there's samples at Costco. The point of the samples is not to get free food. The point of the samples is that you'll go and look for more. So Jesus preached in a way where those that are looking for truth would look for more, and he was happy to give it to them. But those who are just looking for a show would move on, and they wouldn't find more truth. That's what verse 11 is saying. And then he moves forward to verse 12, and he clarifies a bit more. For whosoever hath, to him shall be given, and he shall have more abundance. But whosoever hath not, from him shall be taken away even that he hath. So what this is saying is those who have understanding will later have more understanding. And those who have little to no understanding will have less understanding later. And this is how that works. The disciples responded to the truth they were initially given, and they will be given more truth later when they ask questions. The disciples are given some truth that whets their appetite. They're looking for more truth, and Jesus gives them more truth. But the crowds and the Pharisees, they would often reject, or at the very least, they didn't respond to the truth that they were given, and they were unable to receive greater truth. That's what verse 12 is saying. To those that hath, more shall be given. To those that hath not, it will be taken away. The understanding that they won't have anything to do with. It'll be fruitless. And verse 11 to 12, and one thought would be this: prior response determines future understanding. Prior response leads to future understanding. It's like math class. I'm not about to teach math, I promise. Some of you just had flashbacks to middle school. I'm not about to teach math, but it's like math. Math class builds on prior knowledge. First, you have to learn how to count. Berkeley is getting that part down. She can count all the way up to 13, I think. It's pretty impressive, I have to say. KJ can count 5, 6, 7, 8. That's all he's got. But he's got that down. Berkeley can count to 13. That's the first step, is learning how to count. Then you learn how to add and subtract. Then you learn how to multiply and divide. Then you learn how to do that, but with fractions. I got stuck there for a while when I was in 5th grade. Like several weeks, I couldn't figure that out. Fractions. Then you learn how to do all of that at the same time. And those were called polynomial equations, if you'd remember. Some of you just had more flashbacks, I'm sorry. Polynomial equations came next. And then after that came algebra. And math built on itself. And you couldn't understand the next step until you had the previous step down. Math built on itself. What's the point? Well, if you weren't paying attention, back when you were learning how to count to 10, you probably didn't do well in algebra. That's just how it goes. If you weren't paying attention when you were learning how to add, you probably didn't do well when letters were thrown into the mix. Because math builds on itself. Prior response and understanding, or lack thereof, determines future response and future understanding. So what does this have to do with the parables? That's where verse 13 comes in. Therefore speak I to them in parables, because they seeing see not, and hearing they hear not, neither do they understand. Okay, so the people have ears to hear, and they have ears to hear. They have ears to hear, and they have eyes to see, but they can't see and they can't hear. How does that work? What do you mean that they hear and they can't hear? What does that mean? Well, just ask a lady who has a husband, and she can tell you what that means. We men can listen for a long time without hearing a thing. It's an amazing skill we have, and most of the time it's not intentional. Most of the time it's not intentional. All the time it's not intentional. We can hear a lot without listening to a thing. It's just something that men and mankind has the tendency to have. Or we can see and not see what we're looking for. Just this afternoon, I was looking for a top for my coffee mug to bring back to work, and I could not find it anywhere. And my wife says, well, did you check by the coffee pot? Well, obviously I checked by the coffee pot. It was by the coffee pot. I had eyes to see, but I could not see. People can have ears to hear and not hear, and they can have eyes to see and not see. What does this look like for the crowds of Israel? Israel had a long history of rejecting the prophets of God that were right before them, telling them the truth that was obvious, that was right in front of them. You read about Elijah and Elisha in the books of the Kings, and how they were the only people around that followed after God. And Elijah and Elisha, they pleaded with their people, and the people never responded. And the same is true about Jeremiah, the weeping prophet. And then you have Isaiah, who prophesied that there would come a generation who would have eyes but could not see, and they would have ears that could not hear. And he was talking about the very generation that Jesus was preaching to. And then you have the last prophet, John the Baptist. John the Baptist, one of the greatest preachers to ever walk the earth, yet the people didn't understand, or they chose not to understand his message. And what was John's message? Jesus came to save Israel from their sins as their Messiah. But Israel wanted a Messiah to save them from Rome, not from their sins. And so when the truth was laid out before them, they couldn't hear it, because that wasn't the truth that they were expecting. They couldn't see it because it wasn't the truth they were looking for. So they had eyes to see, they had ears to hear, and the truth was right in front of them, but they couldn't see it and they couldn't hear it because they didn't want to see it and they didn't want to hear it. They rejected, or they simply chose to ignore the truth that was presented to them in verse 15. And then to this, Jesus says something odd. He says their hearts were waxed gross in verse 15. Now, I don't think that that's anybody's life verse that I know of. I know it didn't bless me the first time I read, their hearts waxed gross. So what does that mean? What does it mean to wax gross? Well, do you remember Jesus' parable? The sower went out to sow, and the first ground he describes the seed falling onto is the wayside. The wayside. The wayside was the pathway in between fields where foot traffic would take place. It was a pathway where that was quite used to footfall. It reminds me, my grandfather, he was a farmer, but he wasn't a crop farmer, he was a cow farmer. And he would raise the cattle, and he had multiple fields, but he would always keep one field empty to grow hay so that he could feed them in the winter. And he would move them around to the different fields. But it didn't matter what field they were in, because they had their habits in every single field. And whenever they moved, you could tell exactly where they were going to go based off the paths that they had made in the field. They had the path to the lake, where they would take a bath in the middle of the day to get out of the hot sun. They had the path to the fence, where they would reach their fence through to get the grass that was so much better on the other side of the fence. They had the path to the trees where there was shade. They had the same paths that they would travel every single day. And I forget how many cattle he had. I think he had over 40 cows, if I remember correctly. And every single cow would walk on that same tread and that same path. And that dirt was beat into the ground until it was about as hard as rock. And it didn't matter that they weren't in the field anymore. Whenever he would let the grass grow, it wouldn't grow in the paths, because the ground was absolutely inhospitable for anything to grow. The repeated pressure of the cow's feet on the ground without it being tilled up created an environment impossible for seed to grow in. That's what the wayside is. And that's what Jesus means when he says their heart had waxed gross. The words waxed gross is translated from one Greek word, and it's epaxunte. And it literally means to be thickened, to be made fat, to be deadened, to be unfeeling. It means to be callous, to be calcified. Their hearts had grown callous. So how does dirt turn into a wayside and turn into that rocky ground? It's repeated pressure over and over again that beats the dirt into where it's as hard as rock and nothing can grow. So, well, how does a heart grow callous? Well, how does one grow callous anywhere else? What's the difference between a newborn's foot and my foot? I've been walking on my feet a lot longer than a baby has, so the baby's foot is softer. When I learned how to play guitar, I would get blisters on the edges of my fingers, and I'd get a blister on my thumb right here where I would strum the guitar. And the blisters would hurt, and they would pop. But then the next time the blister came, it wouldn't be as big. It would be a smaller blister. And eventually I stopped getting blisters altogether. And eventually I stopped having pain whatsoever, because I built up a resistance and I built up a callus on the edges of my fingers. There's a reason you can tell if a man works with his hands just by a handshake. You can feel the difference. Conviction is like the first blister. It hurts a lot, and it's really hard to ignore. The Bible elsewhere said that conviction is like getting pricked in your heart. It's like somebody taking a pin and poking your heart with it. Some sermons hurt to hear preached. Absolutely. It's uncomfortable to have your own problems preached about. You feel like everybody's looking at you because everybody knows what problems you deal with. And it's like pastor told everybody to sit to the sides and like he's just preaching to you. Sorry, Brother Ben, I'm not just preaching to you. It's uncomfortable to be confronted with our fallen and broken condition, like having a mirror shown up when we forgot to fix our hair or forgot to brush our teeth. It's uncomfortable to be challenged to grow out of a place of complacency or comfort. That's uncomfortable. And sometimes it's like the preacher knows a little too much about what I'm struggling with. Does he know what I've been struggling with? Did my wife give him my journal or something? Like, what's going on? How does he know this about me? And it's uncomfortable. And it's painful. But we can't ignore it. And if we somehow find a way to ignore it, the next time will hurt too, but it won't hurt quite as bad. And there are always more excuses to ignore what we don't want to confront. That preacher is always mad about something. He'll move on. Why can't he talk about something other than coming out for Go Sunday or money or caring for each other? It's like, oh, it's all he talks about. What he said was true, but I don't really like the way he said it. And instead of responding, we find some other reason to feel upset, and we don't deal with the reason we actually were upset, which is the conviction of God. And eventually, after refusing to acknowledge conviction for long enough, we might not feel anything at all. We have heart disease. Our hearts have become like the wayside soil, hard as a rock, and completely impossible for the seed to grow in. For those that are unfamiliar, the parable of the sower, the seed is the word of God. And the word of God can only grow in good soil. And it's impossible for the seed to take root in a heart that is calloused. The crowds as a whole had closed themselves off to the truth of the gospel in Jesus' day, and their hearts grew callous after repeatedly refusing to deal with the implications of who Christ is and what he said. They either chose to reject it or they would ignore it, and they all did it. They had ears and they had eyes, but they couldn't hear or see what was right in front of them. The Messiah, the person they'd been waiting for, was standing right in front of them and they couldn't see it. Or they chose not to see it. The disciples were blessed to hear and understand the teaching of Jesus in their day, because when truth was given to them, they responded and they grasped it and they looked for more, and Jesus was happy to give it to them, and they were blessed with knowledge that people had been asking for centuries. They had so many blessings given to them. But I have to think, what if the disciples had gotten offended the first time Christ preached on a sin that was their sin? I also have to think, what step in our Christian walk may we be missing out on because we didn't respond when we were given the opportunity to? The problem's the soil, not the seed. And it's nearly impossible. I don't know if you've heard it been said. I pray that no one leaves here the same way they came. Well, that's true, and that will happen nearly every Sunday, because it is nearly impossible to leave the same way as you came when the word is preached. Because either you will respond or you will be more calloused. Either you will respond to what God has preached to you and given to you, or you will reject it or ignore it. And it'll be another prick in the heart that just grows the callus a little thicker. Every sermon we hear is a chance to respond. But if we don't respond when our hearts want to cry out, "Oh me," then eventually that "oh me" turns into a ho-hum. What's the point? I don't really get anything out of it anymore. Okay, you say. I hear you, Caleb. I think I agree for the most part, but what's the big deal? Why should I be concerned? Well, I still come to church. I still enjoy being here. I still listen to the preaching. And from the outside, a calloused heart doesn't look like a disaster. It doesn't. But how many men are sitting in their pews across America every Sunday, faithfully, out of habit, but it's been years since the last time they spoke to God, or God spoke to them, because the last time that God spoke to them, they told him no for the 10th time. How many would-be missionaries are having a midlife crisis in a job that they hate, instead of reaching the lost in the harvest field that God had for them halfway around the world? But they said, no, that can't be me. I won't go. So they're stuck here, farthest away from God's plan, having a midlife crisis. How many faithful church members come to church week after week without getting anything out of the sermon because they stopped responding when God wanted to help them deal with something that they told God was off limits? Why didn't the grass grow in my front lawn? Because the soil wasn't ready. Why doesn't the grass grow where the cows would walk? Because the ground was pounded into something hard that it was impossible for seed to grow in. Why isn't the preaching good anymore? Because your heart isn't open to preaching.
You've closed it off. Why can't you see? Because you've shut your eyes. Why can't you hear? Because you've stopped your ears. That's what Jesus says in verse 15. Like I said, my great-grandfather was a cow farmer. But he wasn't just a cow farmer. He was a lost cow farmer. He married my great-grandma when they were very young, and she was saved. And she raised their kids in church, including my grandmother, who raised her kids in church. And every time we would go see Grandpa, inevitably, somebody would send one of the grandkids, "Grandpa, don't you think it's time to get saved today? I want to be with you in heaven." And I have to imagine that the first time that one of his littles came up to him and asked him that it hit him in his heart. But by the time I got to him, his heart was calloused. He didn't care. It didn't faze him. It was like automatic. Not today. Not today. Not today. Not today. And eventually he didn't even feel the call of God anymore. It's not hopeless. And I want to stress that, because my grandfather had an amazing experience where he was in a car wreck that nearly killed him. And while he's on the operating table, about to go into surgery where nobody thought he would live out of, he called upon God and he got saved. But God had to move in his life in a miraculous way to till up that ground that had grown so rocky for years. Don't wait for God to till up the ground to respond to what he's been trying to say to you. Don't let your heart grow calloused. Because the options are a life without meaning, a life without God, all the way to death, which has happened for many people, or God has to come in and work drastically in your life to make it otherwise. Those are the only two options for a calloused heart. Because after a certain point where you can't even hear the voice of God anymore, how is God going to call you to repent yourself? You can't hear him. Your eyes don't work. Your ears don't work. Don't wait for God to till up the ground to respond to what he's been trying to say to you. Listen when he talks before you can't hear him anymore. And respond to the Lord's voice to avoid a callous heart. Thank you, Brother Dan.